hard thing about criticizing George Barnett as the offensive line coach is the shift with Chris Doyle leaving and the hiring of George Barnett and the loss of Tim Polasek. All those things occurred almost simultaneously. And so it's hard. What do you pinpoint? Is it one of those three things? Is it the loss of Polasek? Is it the loss of Doyle? Or is it just, George Barnett doing a crappy job? Or is it Raymond Brathwaite doing a crappy job? I think you can look at all those things and make an argument, but let's not forget that Kirk Ferentzs he's an offensive line guru. And he's said many times that he spends most of his time. He's not going to micromanage George Barnett, but I guarantee you, Adam, that even this week in practice, Kirk is spending the majority of his time watching the offensive line. And I mean, I think it's just hard to pinpoint. Now, we'll say this. You brought up George Barnett and I brought up Chris Doyle. I said this earlier, I think it was yesterday with Mark Rogers. 2019 was not a good year for that offensive line. And I hate to name names, and I won't do it here, but you know who I'm talking about. Iowa had a pair of guards who were seniors that year who could not block for anything. I beg you to watch the Michigan game back. I beg you to watch the Penn State game back. And the reason I bring that up is because that was before Doyle left. That was before Polasek left. So now that was just 1 year. I get they were better and certainly better before that. They won the Joe Moore Award in 2016. They were certainly serviceable in 2015. Now, Iowa doesn't have this dominant run game that people on the outside think they do. They haven't had a dominant run game since 2008. But my point being, it is hard because they haven't had good lines 3 of the last 4 years. And 2020 was such a weird year. It looked like, okay, they're just going to not miss a beat without Chris Doyle here and without Tim Polasek. But it was such a weird year with COVID. Minnesota was a shell of itself. Michigan State was a shell of itself. Penn State was a shell of itself. Frankly, Wisconsin wasn't very good that year. I believe they had lost like 2 or 3 of their quarterbacks during the season. So it's just hard to know. I think you hit the nail on the head that you fight an internal battle, and I do the same thing because you want to see this work. But at the same time, I think the more fans face reality, they realize. I can't speak for all fans, but I think a lot of fans realize it's probably not going to work until there are staff changes. And I'm not saying Kirk needs to step down. I'm not saying anything specifically. But until there are changes with the coaching staff, because they don't have offensive minds, Adam. I've said this several times now. Brian Ferentz isn't an offensive mind. Kirk Ferentzs isn't an offensive mind. And that's fine. I mean, John Budmeyer, I think, is probably... Think about that. John Budmeyer might be the one guy who I would say is an offensive mind on this coaching staff, and he can't even call plays because he's an analyst. And I mean, he's a cute...
Corey, what other offensive, like a guy with majority of offensive line experience that gets promoted to offensive coordinator that played offensive line that's underperformed as a coach gets also the quarterback coaching position that has no experience coaching quarterbacks really whatsoever, and in a position where, as a program, let's be honest, we've kind of underperformed over the years. That's been the one spot and the one, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, and I can't speak for you, where we haven't really hit the nail on the head. We're starting guys like Jake Christensen over Ricky Stanzi. We're starting guys, over CJ Beathard isn't playing where he should be playing. There's a lot of situations where over the years we're like, can this staff properly evaluate the quarterback position? And this year has been abundantly clear that and Jake Rudock, who I was referring to previously, but this year has abundantly blown it out there that we can't. And, I love Kirk. I love this staff. And this season has really been a slap in the face where it's like, okay, changes need to be made. Big time changes need to be made. And, like you said, I'm not saying Kirk, I want Kirk to go or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But if we have a head coach that's unwilling to adapt and roll with the change, make changes and bend and pivot to win football games and do what he needs to do, then I will go out and say it, like, wholesale changes need to be made, but I think we all know that that's very doubtful that that's going to happen. I think, Kirk leaves when he wants to go on his own terms.
And I'll say this last thing. I know you probably didn't mean for this to be this long of a call, Adam, but I do appreciate you calling in. Not to defend Kirk, because I've been more than critical over recent months, especially the last couple of weeks. But let me just say this, because I do want to. I'm not trying to fool anybody. I try my best to be objective and call things like I see it. And so, being objective, I think I need to admit, I think other people should admit it too, that we just acknowledge the fact that Hayden Fry had stuff going on in his personal life, specifically with his health, that may have affected his decision making. Is it possible that Kirk Ferentzs has something going on in his personal life that could be affecting his judgment? Is that possible?
It's possible for anybody. And,
it's possible for anybody, right? We all have stuff going. Like, there's stuff going on in my life and your life, Adam, that no one else knows. And when you're in the public eye, I'm not making excuses for Kirk. Believe me, a guy's making $7 million a year. I'm not making excuses for him, but I'm just saying, I think we all have to acknowledge that criticism is fair, but when you don't know everything that's going on in a person's life, it's hard to judge them completely. And I think that's what we all have to be careful about. We can be critical, and I'm people in the late 90s were critical of Hayden Fry, no question about it. But when you understand the toll that a health problem, you can think of a million things that could be going on in a person's life that affects their performance at work. Doesn't make it acceptable, but makes it more understandable. And so I'm not trying to imply that I know anything about Kirk Ferentz's personal life. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying it's we don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes that might explain some of this. It doesn't make it okay, though.
No, and you 100% nailed that on the head. And the one thing that a lot of coaches and most coaches in this situation have a hard time coming to grips with is that if you're in a position like this and it's so much affecting, you're in a high profile position like this, and if you have outside things in your life that are affecting something that is this high profile, you need to be able to come to grips with, okay, well, I'm not able to do this to the level that I need to do it, and I'm not able to have the open mind and completely eliminate nepotism or anything like that. And I'm not saying that that's the case, that nepotism is there. It's it's been discussed, and we all have our opinions on that. But if you're not, you got to be able to have enough wherewithal. And the athletic director, most importantly, Gary Barta, has that's Brian Ferentz is reporting directly to. There needs to be enough of a professional, not personal relationship, that if you're seeing things like this happen, you're able to put the personal relationship aside to make a decision and do things that are in the benefit of the university, the football program, and the state of Iowa as a whole. And I think a lot of us as fans have doubts whether those decisions are going to be made the way they need to be made.
I couldn't agree more. And, I see somebody in the chat that didn't like the fact that I was trying to be understanding to people's personal problems. Look, I'm not making excuses for people, but that's also why there's oversight, Adam. You just alluded to it. There is oversight for a reason. And most people, 90% of people who work in any job form, they have a supervisor. And in Gary Barta's, or in Kirk Ferentz's case, it's Gary Barta. And so Gary, if for some reason Kirk is making decisions that are poor decisions for whatever reason, Gary Barta's got to step up to the plate and do something. And that's why, I've been very critical of Gary Barta, because this has been the nepotism, and I believe that's what it is, like it or not. I know this does sound like a strong word, but the nepotism has been enabled. And that's why in no way is it okay. And last thing I'll bring up, I know I've said this like 2 or 3 times now, but you brought up quarterback play in recent years. Let's not forget that, Ken O'Keefe had this quarterback room in a decent place for a number of years. I mean, I understand you talk about Christensen and whatnot, but Iowa got good production out of Nate Stanley in 2017. They got good production out of Ricky Stanzi. I mean, 2010 was a down year, but his stats got better. I think as Ken O'Keefe got older, I don't want to question his zeal to coach, but it just seemed like you could just tell he was getting towards the end of his coaching days. I don't know how I would describe it, if it was just kind of a will to coach, and again, I hate questioning that because I don't know Ken personally, but you watch him on the sideline, he didn't necessarily seem maybe to have the same vigor or fire, and I get it. You get older and you lose some energy. Maybe that's the case, but people now, I've seen people commenting on the channel that, boy, we miss Ken O'Keefe. I don't look at it that way. Adam,
No.
Ken O'Keefe wasn't doing a great job towards the end of his career developing quarterbacks, but the problem is we went from bad to worse. So he wasn't doing a good job, but Ken O'Keefe at least was an offensive mind who knew the quarterback position and knew wide receivers. I mean, coached wide receivers in the NFL. Brian Ferentz has not coached any skill position players besides tight end, specifically quarterback. So that's where we've went from a guy who was not doing great on his, you could say, well below average, to a guy who's, I hate to say it, but no reason to think could even challenge what Ken O'Keefe was doing, even at the end of his career. So it's went from bad to worse. And I don't expect Brian. That's the thing. I don't expect Brian or Kirk to have this wide grasp on passing offense. I mean, you want him to because he's the QB's coach, but you don't expect, like you said, a former offensive lineman who doesn't have any real experience coaching the passing game, specifically quarterbacks. You don't expect him to have knowledge in that area, but you expect the administration and the coaching staff to hire those offensive minds, and unfortunately, they haven't done that.